So now gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Maria Eckstein. So Maria did her PhD at Berkeley and in collaboration with Anne Collins, and now has gone on to work at DeepMind for a couple of years, doing very exciting work there, more on AI side. And Maria has recently been on the job market. I don't know how it's going yet, but she's she's fantastic. She's involved in both of these fields and both of these sort of industry and academia. And very excited to hear from her now. Maria.
Thanks. Thanks so much for having me. So I want to talk more about human reward learning and decision making. And I want to tell you about one model that I've been working with, which I call the hybrid model, which is an attempt to combine the kind of classical models that Anne was talking about earlier with some neural networks. And this is joint work with Nathaniel, Chris, and Kevin at DeepMind. So when we think about learning, what we're really interested in are the representations that people have. So I'm just borrowing the visualization that Ilya showed on the first day, because I think it really makes this point that what happens when we learn is we start with some representation of the world, and then over time that representation changes, and we figure out how different entities in this world relate to each other and might be closer to each other, further away. And people have called this learning of a world model, or structural learning, learning of stimulus-stimulus associations, or representation learning. But when we actually study learning, we investigate behavior. So we go from what a person perceives in a task, for example, to how they respond on this task. And here's just, is my mic dying, or am I good? So here is just one example of this kind of decision-making that does not actually depend on learning. So this is just an example from simple perceptual decision-making, where you can imagine you see a stimulus that has some kind of intensity, and then based on this intensity, that would guide the intensity or the probability of your response. And the way we studied this we studied learning in this study is participants see 4 different stimuli on the screen, and they can pick one of them. So say on the first trial, we choose the red stimulus, we get a reward of 17 points. And then on the second trial, we have the same access to the same stimuli again, and say this time we choose the blue stimulus, we get 80 points. On the third trial, say we choose the green stimulus, we get 48 points. And now, because blue was so good, let's say we choose blue again, and this time we get 78 points. So we collected, so this is what the task looks like. There's one more intricacy, and that is that the actual magnitudes, the actual payoff magnitudes drift over time for this task. And so we collected a relatively large data set on this task with 880 participants who all did multiple blocks of this task. So we have over 4,000 blocks in total. And because we are interested in the underlying algorithm of how people would learn to do this task, we turn to reinforcement learning. And so what this looks like is participants have a representation where each of those choice options is represented by a value. And what happens through learning is that people learn to associate specific values with each of those choice options. And the way participants learn that is through a reinforcement learning value update. So I have the value of my choice option, I calculate the reward prediction error, and that updates my value. So I have an updated value, and that tells me which action to choose, and this leads to the next reward. And this is just a visualization of this simple function. So I'm just plotting rewards here in the x-axis and the new value on the y-axis. And you see that larger rewards lead to larger values. But this also depends on the previous value of this choice option. And notably, both of those relationships are linear. So the new value is linear in the reward, and it's also linear in the previous value. And what we did is we used 80% of our data set to train this model, so to find the parameters to maximize the likelihood of human behavior. And then, because we're not particularly interested in those particular 800 participants who did our task, we're interested in the rest of humanity, we used 10% of our data as a testing set and tested our fitted model on those participants. So this is what I'm showing you here. This is the prediction accuracy of this model on the held-out participants. And you see this model is doing pretty well. It's predicting 55% of the choices that those unseen participants make on this task, which is significantly more than chance, which is at 25%. There's one more trick that people often use when they fit reinforcement learning models, and that is they add a perseverance component. So what that looks like is I just look at what the previous action was, and this action will get a little bonus on the next trial. So just add this little bonus to my value, and together I will make a choice based on those two components. And if I add this little perseverance trick, my model improves in performance, so now I predict almost 60% of the choices in my held out data. And I call this the best RL model because it's the best RL model that I could find for this task. So the next thing I did is I just fitted a vanilla recurrent neural network to the same task. So the way that this model works is it takes information about both the reward and the action of the previous time step, and it directly tries to predict the action that participants will make on the next time step. And notably, this model has access to a latent state. So this is the latent state of this model can hold on to information of previous trials in whatever way it chooses or learns from the data. And so I do the same task as before. I fit my parameters to the training set of the model. I use the remaining 10% of my model as a validation set to tune the hyperparameters of my model, for example, to figure out how many neurons should there be in this hidden layer. And then I use the remaining 10% to actually calculate the prediction accuracy. And what I see is that this model is tremendously better. If you look at the size of the error bars, this is a huge, huge, huge difference. And basically, what this tells us is that human behavior contains substantial amounts of systematic variance that is not captured by the best RL model. In other words, whatever our RL model is explaining is not getting at the true complexity of human behavior in this task. This is systematic. And unfortunately, we can't just use this model as our cognitive model because the neural network is not made to be interpretable in the same way that an RL model is. So I went back to the drawing board, and I thought, OK, so maybe all that's wrong with RL is maybe this update looks just a slightly little bit different from the update that I showed you earlier. So maybe it's not linear in the previous value, maybe it's not linear in the reward, maybe it's somehow tweaked, maybe it scales with the size of the reward prediction or something like that. And because there's a million ways how this update could actually differ from the one that I've written down here, and I did not want to test all of them one by one, I took a little shortcut and just replaced this whole equation with the neural network. So effectively, what this will do is it will fit the whole model together, and this neural network will learn whatever function explains the most variance in my data. So it will capture all of those different variants. And I did the same thing for the perseverance channel as well. And then I fit this model using the same method as before. So does anybody have an intuition? What do you think? Is this model going to fit better than before? Is it going to fit worse than the best RL model? Is it going to be approximately the same? In between? So it's definitely not going to be worse. There's no way this model could be worse because it is strictly a more general model than the RL model. So in the worst case, this model could just learn exactly the equations of the RL model and do exactly as well. So for this reason, I was really surprised when I found that this model is exactly the same as my RL model. There's no improvement at all in the model fit. And when I look at the function that this model actually learns from the data, it looks strikingly similar. It's not exactly the same, but it looks strikingly linear in the same way that the RL model looks like. So I think what we can conclude from this is there's a good reason that so many people have used reinforcement learning models for such a long time. And that reason is that these models are really good models for human reward-guided decision-making. And they capture the data really well. And if you have a model that has much more flexibility, it will still recover this model. However, there still is this huge gap here between the RL model and the RNN. So now we're back to the drawing board and to figure out what is this difference. So the first idea that I had was maybe it's context. There have been a range of studies now that show that the value update actually depends on a lot of other information. For example, if you're interested in updating the value of this right choice option, it might also depend on the current values of all the other choice options. And this is intuitive if you imagine you get 50 points. If 50 is good or bad depends a lot on what the other arms are, if they're better or worse. And so what do people think? Is this going to help? Is it going to not help? Pretty strong consensus, yeah. So I added the same error here for the perseverance system as well. And we fitted the model, and we found a significant improvement in model fit here. So what this tells us is that context seems to play a huge role in human reward-based learning. So the mechanisms that we use to update these values are really dependent on the context. However, you will notice this gap, that we still have not reached the target baseline. And the reason why we thought this might be happening is that maybe the representation we use here to contextualize this update is just not strong enough, it's just not rich enough. So maybe those 4 values, those 4 choice values, just don't hold on to all the information that the system needs in order to contextualize this update properly. So what we did next is we replaced this modulatory input with a hidden layer of those networks, which can learn any kind of representation of the past history. And when we do this and fit the model, we find a model that fits just as good as our baseline. It has no significant difference here to our RNN model. And what this shows is that we can make a model that captures all the structure in human behavior. And if we make this model any more flexible, it will not capture additional variance, which means that all the biases that remain in this model truly capture something that is present in the human behavior. And so how does this model actually work? So here's just a reminder of what the RL value update looks like, and here's what this value update looks like. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that this is definitely not linear. Instead, what seems to be happening is we have a function that looks very similar to what I showed you in the beginning of just perceptual decision making. So it seems like the intensity of my input here, of my reward, determines the intensity of my output, or the probability of choice here, in a very simple sigmoid function. So there's no intermediate computation required. We don't need to calculate a reward prediction error at all. This is just a very simple mapping to what's the reward that I have seen, to how likely am I to choose this action again. And this is an extremely simple function, and the reason we can still capture very complex human behavior with that is hidden in the colors. So what I'm coloring here is the second input that this model gets, is the state input here. So I conducted a PCA just on the state, and I'm just showing the first principal component here. And you see that this component is able to modulate the reward sensitivity. It can make the sigmoid steeper or flatter. And in the same way, other PCs can tweak and shrink and resize the sigmoid in different ways. So how does memory actually work? How does this memory state, how is this learned? So what I can do is I just look at the input of the reward here, and instead of measuring the output Q, I look at how this affects my hidden state. And I see that the hidden state seems to be learned in a pretty simple linear update rule. So larger rewards increase my PC1 a little bit, and smaller rewards decrease it. But I can also peek inside and see what is the content of memory. And in order to do that, I just look at all the states that one participant perceives over the course of a trial, and then I decode the past events from that state just using linear regression. And what I find are 3 components here that seem to hold on to reward information up to 150 trials ago. So those 3 components really get an understanding of how rich or how poor the task is and how that might change. But I also have a small number of components that are flat for most of the time, but they're very spiky in the first few trials. So they seem to have a contrastive code for just the most recent trials that allow them to exactly memorize what happened, which is very reminiscent of short-term memory or working memory in humans. And what's next? I have just shown you that if I have one task, I can tell you what the model is that perfectly explains human behavior in this one task. But we all know that if I had used a different task, maybe the results would have been different. Other models would have been identified, and more often than not, those models are different. And still, we want to believe that there's one algorithm that guides learning and decision-making in all of those tasks, no matter if I have a 4-on probabilistic task or a 2-on switching task. And this reminds me of this nice depiction where we want to believe that where it might be the case that there's one cognitive algorithm that underlies all of those tasks. But if you look at this algorithm from different angles using different paradigms, the same algorithm might just look different. And so I'm working on this project with Jessica Paslick, who's a PhD student at UCL, where we have created a grammar that procedurally generates bandit tasks, where those 3 tasks are specific examples, but the data set of this task is broader and captures the larger majority of bandit tasks. And we hope that if we fit a model to this task, we can actually identify this more general algorithm that would explain behavior across those tasks. We could also use a similar approach to understand different kinds of data. So this is in collaboration with Sebastian and Peter at the MPI in Tübingen. So go to Sebastian's poster later if you want to hear how he's thinking about those models and applying them to the IBL data where mice make perceptual choices. And we could also extend this framework and say, this is with Daniel and Sebastian at Osnabrück, where we can take those neural networks that we fit and then use symbolic regression in order to figure out what are those equations that go into those functions. So in summary, I've shown you 2 parts of this project. We can do model comparison in a space of models that are very general because they contain neural networks, and we can learn a lot about the cognitive architecture of the underlying model. So here, for example, we can say there are 2 different subsystems. One processes rewards, and the other one processes actions, and these are separate. And this is a very strong prediction that I think makes it would be very interesting to test in more ways. And we can also inspect the model. So we can now look at the algorithms, and we find the 2 different levels of processing. Here, one which makes a choice based on a very simple sigmoid mapping, and one that updates the representation that underlies this choice. And this is the end of my talk. I want to thank all of my collaborators, and I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Maria. We can take some questions now, if anyone from the crowd has any, or anyone on Zoom as well, we can read them out. Any questions for Maria?
Hi, thanks for the great talk. So, from what I understood, the update rule is not bringing you much into the fitting of the when you put just that I don't know what happened with your slide with the RNN. So I was wondering how you can relate this with what the humans are. If you're into like a reward maximization kind of scheme, how can you relate what they're trying to do? Let's say, like, what is the reward function of the person? Let's say, if you can at all.
So you're saying that there doesn't seem to be a RL update in the sense?
No. That given that you have your RNN that is a substitute for the value update, how can you relate that to the reward function that they're trying to maximize, let's say?
Yeah, so when I showed the sigmoid, what is on the x-axis is the reward. So pretty much what participants seem to be doing is they map the reward magnitude into a space that is warped by a sigmoid to determine what the value will be. So instead of learning your value by a reward prediction error update, it's a direct mapping. You look at the reward and poof, you already know what the value is. So it's a much, much simpler mapping. And then you can still maximize rewards under that mapping, with the nuance that this mapping will be warped by your current state, which is the memory that you have of the task.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Maria, for the great talk. So my question is about the remaining about 30% of the variance in the data that none of these models could predict. Do you think that's because there are some sort of individual variability across subjects, that they just do different things and it's not possible to capture them in one model? Or something else is happening
This is a fantastic question. Thank you so much for asking that. So it is true, there are 30% more of variance in this data that I'm not capturing. And I think there's several reasons for that. So one is my data set is relatively large, but it still is limited. And what I see is that the larger my data set gets, the more variance I can capture. So it's not impossible that if it just collected 10 size bigger data set, I would be able to capture much, much more variance. So this is my first answer. The second answer, do individual differences play a role? I'm sure they do play a role. And you're right, I have only fitted one model. One thing that I see is that this model seems to be pretty good at capturing individual differences, surprisingly. And I think what is happening is that what is happening in the latent state is confounding both the individual trajectory through the task and also individual differences. So it might capture something like a motivational state, but it might also confuse more motivated participants with less motivated participants as well. And so it's not capturing individual differences as well as a model would where I explicitly tell it about individual differences, but it still picks up on them. So when I simulate data from a participant after fixing it on the first trial, it will be very similar to what the participant did in the past.
Thank you very much for your great talk. I have a fairly simple question. So you showed us several models of how humans might learn, and you showed us how you would train these parameters within those models. One of those was this simple RL model, which had only a handful of parameters, whereas at the very end you had at least 2 recurrent neural nets, right? And recurrent neural nets have way more parameters, but your data set the data set you were using was the same. So I wonder, how did you end up with results which had fairly similar uncertainty between all these models that you showed? Because the latest models had way more parameter, but your data set is essentially the same.
Yeah, that's exactly what I find. So, so you're asking me. So I think one thing to say about this is, yes, the RL models have fewer parameters, and the neural networks have more free parameters, so they can learn more complex functions. I still test all of those models on a held-out test data set. So I don't know if that gets at your question, but that's so they shouldn't be overfitting.
I understand your point, but when I think of in terms of bias variance kind of trade-off, well, our models are more complicated, but we might induce more variance, right? At the end.
I see. Okay, so yeah, okay. So I think what is happening is that those networks still approximate very simple functions. So if you think about the value update, it only has 2 inputs and 1 output. And when I showed you the function, it looked pretty linear. It had this kind of shape. So there's not a lot of variance in that function. And it can also plot it. I only plotted it for 1 points to 100 points because this is what participants saw. But even if I extrapolate beyond that, it still looks like a pretty regular function. So I trained those models for a long time, and I used just L2 weight regularization, which also helped make those functions more smooth. And so I think what happened is because it learned those very simple functions, there's not a lot of variance in there.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you all for the questions. Thank you, Maria, again.
Thank you.
So your laptop.